Good morning, everyone. Uh, I'm not preaching on the Exodus reading today. I'm preaching from Matthew. But I had a little smile when Wendy spoke about that historical theory, which is quite well grounded. A lot of scholars have kind of spoken about it with some research. The idea that manna was actually this highly sugared kind of almost like an amber-like substance left by bugs from the tamarisk tree and was actually excreted by them, which gives a whole other spin on the thing. I remember when I heard that years ago, I thought to myself, well, I like tamarisk trees because in the wheat belt they were invaluable to us because they're very salt tolerant and they soak up a lot of salt-affected water. So we would use them in reclaiming overcleared salt-affected land. So there's that, but the idea is, you hear the phrase manna from heaven and you think, well, bug dung from heaven doesn't have quite the same ring, does it? But then, we all love honey, and I'm sorry if I'm spoiling for you, but honey is chewed up by bees. That's how they make it. They chew it like a cow and with its cud. So, maybe we shouldn't be fussy. We're all putting honey on our toast. Anywho, and I do apologise for the shorts this morning. I'm losing some weight at the moment, and my good pants are in the wash, and I refuse to buy new clothes until that settles down. So I'm sorry. I'm going to be scruffy than usual for a few weeks. Strap yourselves in. Often, when we read the parables Jesus told, we can miss a lot of context without digging into the social environment and norms in which our Nazarene teacher lived his early life. Some, though, are more simply relatable in our society. Sorry, let's get a feedback. Let's think of today's parable of the vineyard labourers in the light of Australia's horticulturalists, who recently warned that they couldn't afford to harvest without employing relatively low-paid international backpackers as fruit pickers. Now, as a former farmer myself, I have complete sympathy for the difficulty of paying wages for an already low profit margin. But I do worry that much of our national fruit industry seems too dependent on a business model that requires a seasonal workforce who will work for pocket change and a bed. We should have some sympathy for those day labourers in today's parable, the ones who were hired early in the day, who fire up and complain about what they see as an unfair decision by the vineyard owner to pay the same daily rate regardless of hours worked. These first century Judeans and Israelites listening to this story would have identified with that because they were already angry, aware of what they'd lost in their dispossession by the Romans. Now, the hearers of this first story would be so aware that these people signing up for day labour, whatever they could get, queuing for work they may or may not get, having to accept whatever pay was on offer, these would have been Hebrew people who perhaps family formerly owned land. Perhaps their families were the former vineyard owners till the Romans came in and gave it off to their rich friends. Or perhaps they've always been casual vineyard labourers, but in the past, their grandfathers and parents were used to being paid, by other Hebrews who would have presumably been far more respectful and supportive in setting their wages. So these people, the ones who complain, they're not greedy, they're not selfish, they're not pig the pug. They're probably envious and rivalrous, which is what people become when they're living in financial insecurity. And is this really so difficult to Australia today, where many voice suspicion and anger at Chinese companies, as a particular example, who buy up and operate local agricultural and mining leases? There is something, we must admit, about foreigners controlling land and industry that sticks in a people's craw. And that's a very old tension here, by the way, in the relatively short history of colonial Australia. Resentment of Chinese and Afghani involvement in the gold mining industry led directly to the introduction of the White Australia policy. The legislation was symbolically xenophobic and fueled generational racism, but the motivation was economically protectionist. So many people come to any labour market at any time from both sides of a perceived divide, already cranky about perceived and probably real difficulty and unfairness for wage earners on the one hand and wage payers on the other. I'm focusing on this today, and I'm wary that after last week when I preached on forgiveness of debt, Maybe some of you are thinking, oh goody, here goes Monty the Chardonnay Marxist waving his red flag again. Please do know, sincerely, this is not me pushing a self-derived political opinion on you. I try to do what we disciples should, to take our lead from the teaching of Jesus and aspire to the equal humanity of the kingdom of God. And besides, if I am a Marxist, I'm very, very bad at it. I have held the means of production all to myself. I've owned or part-owned several small businesses, and I've employed staff. I care about business, I'm interested in business, and I read a lot of business articles. And that's where I came upon the story of Dan Price and his company, Gravity Payments, which is a complementary comparison, I think, to today's gospel. Dan Price grew up in a conservative evangelical Christian family in rural Idaho. Conservative here is probably an understatement. Dan, at just 16 years of age, had to promise to one day marry his high school sweetheart before he was allowed to date her without a chaperone present. Post-high school, Dan joined a Christian rock trio who was successful enough to tour and record albums. And this makes complete sense when you see a photo of the guy. He's probably about my age, but just a physically beautiful man with a beard and long hair. Imagine Brad Pitt cast in the lead in Jesus Christ Superstar. You've got the picture. Of all Dan's talents, what he truly excelled at was making business deals. So eventually, he and his tech wizard brother started up a company in Seattle, Washington called Gravity Payments. Basically, they found a niche providing software for online credit card payments. The company was very successful very early by startup business standards. And in time, Dan brought out the controlling share of the business from his brother, who went on to another enterprise. And everything was going beautifully. The company was big and thriving. They had a lot of staff. They're making bank, as they say out there on the streets. But then Dan had a Damascus Road-style life interruption. He was having a quiet moment outside with one of his employees when the fella got emotional and recklessly honest with his boss about his resentment over his low rate of pay. Dan gently defended the rate, which was based on market standards. If you have different data, he said to his employee, about market rates of pay, send them to me, let me know, I'll look at them. His employee got even angrier and wasn't wearing this, and he told Dan it wasn't about market rates. It was about Dan driving a luxury sports car while this fellow was struggling to provide a good life for his family. Like Saul of Tarsus, struck blind after meeting the risen Christ, Dan was disturbed by this and fell into a depression that lasted some time. Eventually, his wife, yes, that's right, the high school sweetheart, she did follow through on marrying, she offered the wisdom that Dan needed to heal, saying, "So this obviously bothers you deeply. What are you going to do about it?" Dan made a monumental change that provoked a massive controversy in American business. He instituted a $70,000 minimum wage across the breadth of his company. He even dropped his own affluent CEO's salary to that rate. So, the minimum salary was the universal salary. That was it in the company. No more, no less. And the wages of everyone else from the janitor up were matched. The change was seismic. Effectively, this company no longer had the hierarchy of from the janitor up. There was no up and there was no down anymore. And here's where this story directly rubs against Jesus' tale of disgruntled vineyard labourers. A number of Dan's formerly high-level employees quit. These people couldn't accept being on the same rate as the kid who goes for the coffee and loads the photocopier. Again, envy and rivalry, just like today's parable. And you just know this caused a national backlash in America for Dan and the company. Let's remember the US of A is the world's poster child for free trade. I mean, this was the nation where Senator Joe McCarthy had destroyed lives in his inquisition of suspected communists, where Billy Graham regularly called anything resembling egalitarian economics the direct work of Satan. Fox News went after Dan with a venom usually reserved for terrorists. Dan stuck to his new convictions, and increased staff productivity fueled a 40% increase in profit in that first year. So equality wasn't just some hippy-dippy ideal, it turned out to be very smart business. To me, it's entirely self-evident how this current story of tech company labourers lines up neatly against the story of vineyard labourers that Jesus told 2,000 years ago. And I could drag this out by illustrating the connections point by point, but I'm sure the dots on the page are obvious enough for us all to join them up. And how you feel in response to this comparison probably indicates where you sit politically and in your economic philosophy. I'd ask you, in prayerfully reflecting on this as you go away, try to put all that aside. I no longer answer to labels like right wing, left wing, because we're not defined here by secular political labels or alliances. We're defined as students of Jesus. And the Jesus we meet in the Gospel of Matthew, speaking to a grieving and dispossessed people, is going to rattle us sometimes. The first disciples were often rattled, and why should we be any different? Having our cage shaken sometimes is not comfortable, but it is part of the learning. The irony is not lost on me, friends, that I'm preaching this to you as your one single salary employee in our little organisation that is run and driven by the generosity and labour of volunteers. And that tension does sit with me daily. And yet, I find the story of Gravity Payments an example of a rude breaking in of the kingdom of God in our time. So many folks coming against Dan Price and his team with their nails and crosses out seems to affirm this for me. Seems to me a company can go on writing lists of values or, like Jesus, actually live by them. This can invite blowback, criticism and harm, as it did for our teacher. Sharing generously and recklessly, even when it appears to some as unfair, is not imprudent. As Jesus said, it's an example of what the kingdom of God is like. Peace be with you. Sisters and brothers, for our closing hymn today, we're going to sing a slightly revised version of For the Fruits of All Creation. What jumped out at me about this revised version is the first two lines you can see up there. For the gifts of earth's abundance, thanks be to God. For ample round the world's circumference, thanks be to God. I think we often want to neglect the problem of starvation and famine in the world by saying, well, there's not enough food to go around. And of course, all of us know there's plenty. There is absolutely plenty. But it's often overpriced or inaccessible. And that's one thing very much to think about. Yes, drought happens, famine happens, it happens to all the world at different times. The weather seems becoming more unpredictable, it's not going away, but there's always plenty. So let's sing this last hymn together.